I wasn't supposed to be there. That much was clear from the moment I walked into the hall and saw my name missing from the program. It was my mother's 25th anniversary celebration at the hospital, 2.5 decades as a trauma nurse, and the room was packed with co-workers, family friends, people she'd stitched back together in the ER and probably remembered by injury more than name. Everyone was smiling, clapping, telling stories that made her sound like a saint in scrubs. Except me. I wasn't mentioned, not once. No photo of me in the slideshow. No seat saved near the front. Just a folded chair near the back next to the exit sign like I'd wandered in by mistake. I stood there anyway, arms folded behind me like I was back in formation, even though I'd spent years trying to forget that kind of posture when I wasn't on duty. You know, Richard had said earlier that day, standing in the kitchen with a mug in his hand and that familiar smirk on his face, maybe don't wear the uniform tonight. People might get the wrong idea. I had just looked at him and blinked. No response. 'Cause how do you even answer something that's small and sharp and designed to cut without showing the blood? So I didn't wear it. I left the dress blues hanging in the garment bag and put on a navy blouse instead. Plain. Neutral. The kind of clothing you pick when you're trying not to start a war in a room full of people who still call you kiddo, like it's a compliment. The room was glowing. Literally, gold string lights, white tablecloths, soft jazz playing from a corner speaker. Waiters in crisp black vests carried around shrimp skewers and mini quiches. There was laughter, handshakes. People crying a little when they talked about how Mum had saved their father, their wife, their son. I should have felt proud. I should have been glowing too. But there I was, watching from the sidelines, like a guest who'd lost their invitation. Then Richard stepped up to the podium. Tall, confident, still wearing that old sheriff's badge on his belt like it meant more than the truth. "We're here tonight to honour a woman who's kept this community standing," he said, voice booming like a campaign speech. "Evelyn's not just a nurse. She's a force, a survivor, and she raised a daughter almost entirely on her own. I mean, mostly. That got a laugh. One of those cheap, nervous ones people do when they're not sure if it's a joke." My mother smiled thinly from her chair on stage. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes didn't meet mine. "Not once," Richard leaned into the mic. "She's the real hero in our family." The words echoed like a slap. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just stood there, heart thudding behind my ribs like it wanted to knock something over. The photographer panned across the room, capturing smiles and toasts and everything except me. No one even noticed I was still standing. No one asked me to join her on stage. No one remembered that I'd flown across the country just to be there, just to be invisible. But here's what they didn't know, what Richard never understood and never wanted to. I wasn't quiet because I was weak. I was quiet because silence is the sharpest weapon I own. You don't make it to Major General by shouting. You make it by observing, by calculating, by waiting until the moment they think they've got you cornered, and then flipping the entire room upside down with nothing but a word. My name is Eliza Carter, Major General, United States Army, Deputy Director of Joint Strategic Operations. I've briefed heads of state diffused threats that never made headlines, and held more power in one secure login than Richard's badge ever gave him. And yet, there I was, a decorated officer, a strategic architect of global defense, standing invisible in a room that should have felt like home. I stood there, surrounded by fairy lights and fake applause, dressed like an extra in my own mother's life, and I waited, because I knew something Richard didn't. You can only erase someone for so long before they draw themselves back in bolder, brighter, louder than you ever imagined. And when that day comes, you won't be ready. Not for me. I was never meant to be small. Not even when I was 7, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, beside my dad's boots, watching him trace red pins across a corkboard map of the world. Each one of these, he'd whisper, tapping a tiny city in Syria, means something moved. Someone blinked. Someone made a choice. He never talked down to me, never sugar-coated the world. My dad, Major Thomas Carter, believed in intel, in preparation, in clarity. But more than that, he believed in me. He'd lean down, hand me a pin and say, "Where would you deploy, First Lieutenant?" I always picked the hardest spot, the hottest zone, the one with the fewest pins, because that's where they'll need someone who sees what others don't. I'd say, my voice all seriousness, even in pajamas. He'd smile slow and proud and stick that pin exactly where I pointed. Our map wasn't just a game, it was a promise. A future we were sketching together with colours and thumbtacks. He never pushed me to follow in his footsteps, but somehow I knew I would. He called me Eagle Eyes, said I noticed things even trained officers missed. I believed him. Until the knock came. I was 9 when 2 men in uniform stood on our porch. One held a folder. The other wouldn't meet my mother's eyes. She dropped to her knees before they said a word. They never even made it inside. After that, the map stayed rolled up in the back of my closet. The pins gathered dust in a mason jar. My mother, Evelyn, stopped cooking eggs the way he liked. She stopped humming when she folded laundry. For a long time, she stopped looking up at all. And me, I became quieter. Not smaller, just folded in, compact, waiting. The world got sharper, colder. I went from eagle eyes to invisible. But the last gift my dad gave me wasn't the map. It was the mindset. Observe, remember, strategize. I remember kneeling by my bed that night, whispering a promise into the silence. "I'll finish it, Dad. I'll go further than you did. I'll be the red pin no one can move." And for a while, that was enough. Until Richard moved in. He brought noise, rules, smiles that didn't reach his eyes. At 12, I was back in a house full of uniforms, but none of them fit anymore. None of them were his. And yet, I wore the silence like armor. Because part of me already knew, before you can rise, you have to survive. 3 months ago, I stood outside the house on Brookwood Lane for the first time in over a decade. Same beige siding, same cracked driveway, same wind chimes on the porch that never quite matched the season. I was a major general with 2 encrypted phones and a direct line to the Joint Strategic Command. But at that moment, I was just a daughter with nowhere else to go. My condo in Arlington was under emergency repair after a burst water main flooded the entire South Wing. The Army offered temporary officer housing, but my mother beat them to it with a single text. "Just stay here, honey. We have space. Richard won't bother you." I should have said no, I almost did. But some part of me, the part still clinging to the girl in the red pin dream, wanted to believe I could survive 6 weeks under the same roof without unravelling. Besides, I had protocols. Portable encryption systems, a secure laptop, 2 emergency exits pre-mapped. I could do this. Day 1, Richard opened the door. No smile, just a nod. He wore an old sheriff's department sweatshirt, faded and loose like it was stitched from old grudges. "You look busy," he said, eyeing my duffel and the hard case with military-grade locks. "That all for a weekend?" I stepped inside my boots, clicking against the tile. "Just until repairs finish. Won't be long." He didn't respond, just turned and walked back to the living room, where the police scanner still buzzed quietly like a second heartbeat. Mum emerged from the kitchen with a warm hug and a tray of her famous oatmeal cookies, as if sugar could soften concrete. They gave me the guest room. My old room. Same mint green walls, same ceiling fan that clicked on the 3rd speed. I set up a mobile command station, encrypted router signal scrambler, biometric keypad, tucked everything beneath the desk like it was just a gaming setup. From the outside, it looked harmless. just another adult kid crashing at home. Except I hadn't been a kid in a very long time. The first few days were quiet. Mum knocked gently before entering. Richard less so. He lingered, asked questions that sounded casual but landed like shrapnel. Still, doing that logistics thing must be a lot of spreadsheets. Or, funny how no one ever calls the house phone. You must work with ghosts. I smiled. I nodded. I lied, because when you're sitting in a nest of dry leaves, you don't strike the match. But he noticed things. The blinking red light on my door during live calls. The military-grade case I never left unattended. One morning, I caught him outside my room, hand hovering near the knob. He looked up startled, then forced a laugh. Just checking if the vent's still rattling? It wasn't, and we both knew it. By the end of week 1, the air in the house was thick, like humidity laced with suspicion. He made coffee too loudly, closed cabinets with just enough force to make a point, and always watched me like I was a puzzle he never meant to solve, but couldn't help obsessing over. Mum tried to play peacekeeper. He's just curious, Eliza. It's hard for him to adjust. I didn't say what I wanted to, that Richard Dawson had never adjusted to anything that didn't orbit around him. Instead, I just smiled and said, I'll be gone soon. Because that's what I believed, until the moment I realized I wasn't just being watched, I was being hunted. It started subtly post-it notes with half-written grocery lists that suddenly included items I'd mentioned only during encrypted briefings, a slight reorganization of my books, like someone had scanned the titles for patterns. Even the family desktop browser showed search history related to military rank, verification, and remote access codes. Richard wasn't just watching, he was probing. One night, I woke to find the hallway light on, and his shadow just outside my door. I listened heart-pounding as he stood there silent. He didn't knock, didn't speak, just lingered, like he was waiting for something, or daring me to flinch. I didn't. Instead, I reviewed my counter-surveillance protocol, installed new biometric restrictions on my equipment, relocated sensitive files to a remote black site server. If Richard wanted a game of cat and mouse, I would be the ghost he could never catch. Still, it gnawed at me. Not the fear, the familiarity. The way his presence made the walls feel thinner. The way he took up space without moving, rewrote reality with silence. He hadn't changed, but I had, and that made him dangerous. What he didn't realize, what he never realized, was that every question, every glance, every closed-door conversation with my mother, where I caught the words, "She's not telling us everything," only made me sharper. I logged his patterns, tracked his routes around the house, measured his moods like barometric pressure, because that's what I do. That's what made me Major General, and that's what was going to save me. But I didn't learn that skill in a war zone. I learned it in a dining room under a ceiling fan that hummed louder than anyone ever spoke. I was 12 when Richard moved in. Glenridge Middle School had just started letting kids sign up for junior ROTC electives, and I'd picked it before I even unpacked my lunchbox. I still remember the way my heart raced when I first held the canvas strap of a practice pack, the way I memorized the chain of command like it was poetry. I came home that day, clutching the brochure, buzzing with the kind of energy only kids with purpose have. "You're 12, Richard said that night at dinner, tearing into his steak like it had insulted him. "That uniform fantasy is cute, but let's not pretend it's real." I didn't reply. I'd learned early that speaking up meant inviting scrutiny, and scrutiny under his roof wasn't curiosity. It was a hunt for weakness. Mom stayed quiet too, eyes fixed on her mashed potatoes, like they might offer an escape route. "She's got this whole soldier persona now," he continued, slicing through his words with a fork. "But it's all pretend. She's a blank slate, white paper. not lived enough to know what real looks like. I remember that night, not because of what he said, but because of what I felt, the clenching, the heat rising in my chest, the reflex to defend, and the stronger instinct to survive. So I swallowed my voice with my dinner. Later upstairs, I pulled out the old mason jar from the back of my closet, the one still filled with the red pins Dad and I used to map out the world. I held one between my fingers, pressed it to my palm until it hurt. Not enough to bleed, just enough to remember. The next morning, I wore my JROTC patch anyway. Richard scoffed. Little general reporting for duty. But I noticed he didn't take his eyes off me the entire time I buttered my toast. At school, I found order, routines, a world with rules that didn't change depending on someone else's mood. I thrived in formations, devoured manuals, practiced salutes in the mirror. My instructors called me precise, focused, unshakable. They didn't know it was because at home everything felt like an ambush. Dinner became a performance. Richard tossing out passive digs, Mum trying to smile through them, me calculating exits and reactions like a chessboard. You know what she needs, he'd say, swirling his wine a little failure. Builds character. I kept eating. Quiet, measured, my fork scraping the plate like it was Morse code only I could read. It was in that house, in those moments, that I learned silence could be weaponized. That to endure is not the same as to accept. That people underestimate what they can't hear. And in that silence, I planned. I trained. I became a soldier before I ever wore the uniform. Because the battlefield wasn't overseas, it was across the dinner table. One night stands out more than most. We were having meatloaf. The TV played softly in the background, some local news segment about budget cuts at the sheriff's department. Richard turned the volume up and looked straight at me. See that? That's reality, not some boot camp fantasy. I didn't flinch, just reached for the salt. What she needs, he added. Voice louder now, is to stop pretending she's some big shot. She'll grow out of it. Mum mumbled something, maybe an attempt at diffusing, but the words came out flat, like wilted lettuce. I looked at her, hoping for a flicker of alliance, but she just stared down at her plate. I wasn't alone, but I was outnumbered. That night, I rearranged my room, moved my mattress to the floor military style, started setting alarms at 5 a.m., did push-ups before school, drilled myself in discipline, not because anyone told me to, but because discipline was mine. Richard couldn't touch it. In history class, I began studying military campaigns obsessively, not just for tests for understanding, for pattern recognition. What made leaders fail? What made them rise? I read about pattern, about Eisenhower, about commanders who saw more than just maps, they saw intention. And every time Richard told me I was overthinking, overreaching, overly dramatic, I made a note, not out loud, but in my spine, in my resolve. At 13, I applied for a summer youth program at the Air Force Base 3 hours away. Richard found the acceptance letter. He laughed. Eliza Carter. At a base, they'll chew her up. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Let them try." It was the first time I'd spoken back. He stared at me for a long moment, then smiled, but not kindly. "You're just like your father," he said. Too stubborn to know when to quit. He meant it as an insult. I took it as an inheritance. And I carried that inheritance with me all the way to West Point. Not in a suitcase, those were light minimal designed for speed, but inside me, like steel woven into bone. The United States Military Academy didn't care about your traumas, your daddy issues, or the names people used to reduce you. It cared about your grit, your obedience, your ability to get back up after being broken down. And I did. Again and again, until breaking became indistinguishable from building. I learned to shine boots until I saw myself in the reflection, to iron creases sharp enough to cut through doubt, to run farther, yell louder, memorize faster than anyone around me. Not because I needed the medals. Those came later, but because I needed to know I could outlast every voice that ever told me I wouldn't. West Point was ruthless, but it was honest. Unlike home, it never pretended to love you while measuring your worth behind your back. It taught me that pain was a data point. Failure was feedback, and silence could be strategy. My first year, I made the dean's list. My second year, I earned a leadership commendation for orchestrating a crisis simulation so airtight, my commanding officer said it could have been real-world ops. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell Richard. At some point, the desire to prove myself to them calcified into something quieter, something cleaner. I didn't need them to see me. I just needed to make sure they couldn't stop me. Still, there were nights when the lights were out, and the barracks were silent, and I'd trace the invisible lines of that old map from memory. Wonder where Dad would have put the next red pin. Wonder if he'd be proud. But I never let those thoughts linger long. Sentiment was sand in the gears. I had objectives, missions, a chain of command to climb like a ladder, with no rung wide enough for nostalgia. By the time I graduated, I'd earned a commission that placed me straight into intelligence. Not the sexiest post, not the loudest, but the one that required you to see 10 moves ahead, the kind where power moved like shadows, quiet, strategic, lethal. It fit me. I fit it. And when the army called me exceptional, I made no room for that compliment in my past. I didn't send photos home, didn't mention promotions, didn't answer Richard's awkward attempts at small talk the few times he got hold of the family phone. Mum would ask gently, "Did you want me to tell him about the award?" I'd shake my head. No need. Because what Richard thought, what Richard didn't know, had no bearing on my velocity. He'd lost the right to narrate my life the day he called my purpose pretend. So, I built my own room, metaphorically. One with no need for approval. One fortified with facts and operations, and a version of myself that was impermeable to doubt. I was no longer the girl with the red pin. I was the commander of maps no one else could read. There was a moment, third year, in the one that told me I'd crossed a threshold. We were deep into a war game my team pinned down in a simulated hostage crisis, with 5 minutes left on the clock. The others panicked, looking for the obvious escape route. I found the pattern, rerouted our flank, and neutralized the scenario in under 2 minutes. My instructor pulled me aside after and said, "You don't just follow orders, Carter. You read between them. That's what makes you dangerous." Dangerous. I'd been called that before, but never with respect. That word from him wasn't a warning. It was a coronation. I stopped going home for the holidays. Not because I didn't miss my mother, but because home stopped being a place and became a memory with sharp edges. Richard sent one card, Christmas 2014, with a photo of him and Mom at the community centre gala. No note, just 2 faces beaming in borrowed light. I threw it out unopened. At Fort Huachuca, I started mentoring younger cadets. They called me the little general behind my back, half affection, half awe. It didn't bother me. If anything, it reminded me of those early days with the JROTC patch and Richard's voice saying I'd grow out of it. I never did. I grew into it. And I made sure every step I took left a boot print he could never erase. I created systems, fail-safes, a career built on precision and defiance in equal measure. When promotions came, I accepted them with the same calm I used to survive those dinners long ago. Never boastful, never apologetic, just certain. There was power in no longer needing to explain myself. The last time I saw Richard's name on caller ID, I didn't answer. It rang, it stopped, it never came back. That silence, that was mine too. But silence doesn't mean stillness. Not in my world. In intelligence, the quietest rooms held the loudest consequences. My first deployment wasn't to a battlefield. It was to a secure command center under a desert base where we mapped human behavior like terrain, where data points pulsed like heartbeats, and the war was measured in whispers and wake-up calls. I lived inside threat matrices and strategic overlays, sometimes forgetting to eat, often forgetting to sleep. My colleagues called it burnout. I called it focus. I advanced fast. Too fast, some said. Quota promotions I overheard once walking past a break room. She's got a look. Polished. Smart enough to pass. Pretty enough to present. I didn't stop walking, didn't confront, just filed the voice to memory. Because that's what soldiers do. We don't always shoot the insult. Sometimes we track it until it leads somewhere useful. What they didn't see were the nights I stayed late running simulations that averted 2 potential embassy evacuations. The morning I flagged an intercepted phone call out of Erbil that turned out to be the missing link in a terror cell's travel pattern. I didn't make noise. I made results. And results speak for themselves eventually. But not to Richard. Not. My mother called during my second year on base. Casual, soft-voiced. He said, "You got another medal." For some paper thing. Paper, I echoed, half laughing. It was for operational continuity. We kept 3 outposts from going dark during a systems breach. That's what I told him, she said. Then, quieter. He just doesn't understand. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. That was the last call I took that month, because every time Richard dismissed my work as paper soldier stuff, he reminded me why I never brought home my uniforms, why I never asked him to read my citations. He wasn't built to see anything he couldn't holster or handcuff, but I wasn't built to need his belief. That was the difference. By year 4, I was briefing at the Pentagon, not leading yet, but standing behind those who did. I watched how they carried power, not just in words, but in presence. The weight of certainty, the stillness that came when you knew the battlefield better than anyone else. I started speaking more, not louder, just sharper. When the offer came to transition into joint strategic operations, I said yes without flinching. I knew what it meant. Less field work, more oversight, fewer ribbons, more responsibility. But I wasn't chasing aesthetics, I was building architecture. And when I entered the Joint Strategic Compound for the first time, badge-clipped spine, straight there was a moment brief but electric, where I remembered that red pin in my father's hand. Syria, the heat zone, the place no one wanted. That's where I was now. Not geographically, but symbolically. The centre of complexity, the heart of ambiguity. And I was ready. Of course, that's when the letter came. It arrived in a manila envelope unmarked, but for the return address, my mother's handwriting. Inside, a photograph of Richard in his sheriff's uniform, cutting the ribbon on a new community centre. He looked proud, self-important, alone. Scrawled on the back in her handwriting, he said to tell you he's still the one people come to. I didn't respond, not out of malice, out of math, because the sum of his approval was no longer a variable in my equation. Instead, I focused on the war games ahead, the real ones, the quiet ones, the meetings where policy met contingency, where I offered insight not to be heard, but to be obeyed, where lives hung on logistics, where we mapped chaos into coherence. They called me the fixer. Sometimes the ghost, always with respect, because I delivered, on time, on target, without need for applause. One day, during a debrief, a colonel muttered, "Who trained her?" My commander replied, "No one trained her. She trained us." That line stayed with me, not because I believed it, but because it confirmed something I'd always hoped, that even when invisible, I left a mark. When the Pentagon offered me Deputy Director of Joint Strategic Operations, I said yes. Then booked a flight home. Not to celebrate, not to announce, to test the structure I'd built. I arrived just in time for my mother's 25th anniversary celebration, but I wasn't invited, not as a daughter, not as a soldier. I stood in the margins of her triumph like I always had, watching, recording, remembering. And maybe that was the real test, because you can learn a lot from being excluded. You learn what story they want the world to hear. You learn who's comfortable with your absence. And you learn most of all that silence isn't always an oversight. Sometimes it's a design. So I stayed, not for the cake or the toasts or the slideshow that forgot me. I stayed because exclusion gave me a vantage point. And from that angle, something started to itch beneath the surface, an unease I couldn't name not yet. Not rage, not grief, suspicion. But under the calm, I lingered in something I'd never fully voiced suspicion. The kind that screamed, "I'm being watched. Just because you live under someone's roof doesn't mean you have their trust." And until that changes, I'd treat this as a forward operating base, not home. On day 7, Richard asked if I wanted to join them for dinner. "Your mom's making that roast, you," like he said, too cheerful, like bait with the hook still showing. I paused, mid-email eyes flickering to the small security cam disguised as a charger in the corner of my room. "Sure," I said, matching his tone. Wouldn't miss it. I powered down the drive, closed the laptop, and slipped a sliver of paper into the hinge. Not for security, but to see if it would be opened. If it moved even a millimetre, I'd know. At dinner, Mum served the roast with extra carrots, my childhood favourite. She asked about my day, about the logistics I was supposedly juggling. I kept the lies light vague, mostly reviewing regional readiness reports, I said. Richard leaned in. "Still in touch with that commander? The one from Fort Bragg?" I met his eyes. "Can't say I am." "Why?" He shrugged, "just wondering how many people know where to find you these days." It was casual. It was calculated. I chewed slowly, counted the seconds between his words. He wasn't asking. He was measuring, testing my alertness, my tells. Later that night, I retrieved the paper from the laptop hinge. Shifted. Barely. But shifted. My room had been entered. So I escalated. I filed a passive intel report to Fort Meade, cloaked under civilian status. I activated proximity alerts on my equipment, changed all port access credentials, and removed any trace of my presence from the family Wi-Fi router. Richard wouldn't find breadcrumbs because I stopped leaving them. Still, he tried. Asked if I'd made any new friends during my stay. Asked if I missed DC or if all the ghosts were here now. His language got slipperier, more coded. He was digging not for facts, but for fractures. What he didn't see, what he never saw, was that I'd already built internal redundancies for my peace. His questions didn't destabilize me. They informed me. I logged them, measured them, plotted them like coordinates on an invisible map. Mum stayed gentle, oblivious to the low-level Cold War and spooling in her own home. She made tea, folded towels, asked if I needed anything. I kept my answers simple, loving but strategic. She didn't need to know the full scope of my protocols. She just needed to feel safe. That was my job now. One afternoon, I came home early from a classified meeting off-site. The living room was quiet. Too quiet. I crept down the hallway and noticed a faint glow under the guest room door. My heart slowed. Focus narrowed. I stepped forward, pushed it open without sound. No one there. But the desk lamp was on, and the laptop closed and slightly ajar had a new smudge on the trackpad. I hadn't touched it since morning. That was the final flag. I installed a second layer of tripwires, digital and physical. I set motion sensors in the hallway ones that pinged my watch discreetly. I changed the door lock to a silent magnetic seal. If Richard wanted access, he'd need a degree in cryptography or a crowbar. Neither would end well. And yet, I didn't leave. I could have. The army would have housed me in a heartbeat. But something in me needed to stay, not out of pride, out of data. I was gathering evidence not just for protocols, but for understanding. understanding how men like Richard operate in silence, in shadows, under the mask of civility, and how often the battlefield is domestic, not foreign. That house became my most intimate operation. Every drawer, every conversation, every silence was logged and assessed. I wasn't just living there. I was watching the watcher, and deep down I knew I was getting closer to something, to a crack, to a mistake, to the moment the hunter would forget I'd long since become the apex. And then it happened, not all at once, but in fragments, like glass spiderwebbing from pressure it never expected. Richard began carrying a little leather-bound notebook, the kind retirees use for crossword puzzles or nostalgic grocery lists. Except this one had no errands, no doodles, just names, dates, half-formed phrases in jagged pen strokes. I caught it once open by accident. My name, a string of numbers, and a single word underlined twice ghost. He fancied himself a detective now. Not officially, his badge had long since rusted into memory, but in that dangerous self-appointed way some men adopt when the world stops asking them for answers. He started asking more pointed questions. Hey, remind me what's a major general make these days more than a sheriff, I bet. Or you ever wonder if the military does background checks deep enough? Gotta keep out the imposters. I didn't flinch, didn't correct. Suspicion without a strategy is just noise. And I'd spent a lifetime learning how to hear only the signal. But I felt it shift the morning I found my phone secured with biometric encryption, resting at the wrong angle on the counter. The difference was millimetric, but I knew it hadn't been mine. A faint smudge curved across the front-facing camera, as if someone had picked it up, stared, and set it down like nothing happened. But something had. Later that day, while I was in a secure briefing via VPN on my laptop, I noticed the family desktop, technically communal, still humming in the background. The browser minimized, the energy too clean, too careful. Like someone had tried to erase footprints before realizing I'd long since dusted the entire house for them. That evening, he waited until dinner. The same overcooked meatloaf, the same wine-stained tension. He stabbed at his potatoes and said, "You hear about that fraud case? Some guy made up clearance codes. Ghost-level access, I think they called it. Makes you wonder who's really qualified to wear stars." His eyes flicked toward mine. Waiting, measuring. I took a bite of salad chewed. Didn't blink, didn't give him anything. But inside, the line had been crossed. What he didn't know was that by then I'd already activated my mirror server. Every search, every keystroke on the home network was logged, time-stamped and uploaded to a black site archive 2 continents away. Not just for defense, for exposure. Because men like Richard don't break with confrontation. They break with evidence. I scanned the logs that night. 3 key searches from the family computer, military rank verification, anonymous fraud report, Army and my name spelled fully middle initial, and all followed by fake. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was premeditation. He got bolder after that. I started finding objects moved just barely. My encrypted drive nudged a centimetre out of alignment. Once I left my laptop lid down. When I returned, there was a faint fingerprint near the biometric scanner, and the internal system showed 2 failed attempts within a 2-minute window, time stamped while I was at CVS. My protocols held. But the fact that he tried, that told me everything. Then came the garage incident. He was waiting for me after a run, blocking the exit like he still ran drills from his glory days. "Evelyn says you've been working a lot of late nights," he said, arms crossed. "Funny thing is, I looked up your department. Couldn't find your name anywhere." "That's the point of my department," I said. "It's not supposed to be found." "Convenient," he muttered, stepping closer. My hand tightened on the flash drive in my jacket, the one labelled Countermeasure R. a full digital case file. Access attempts, metadata, psychological profile. If he moved any closer, I'd drop it in Mum's cookie jar where the feds could find it with a warrant. But I didn't need to. Not yet. You think I'm just going to let you parade around here with your fake credentials? He hissed. I know people. Real officers. I make one call. Then make it, I said. Not loud, not angry, just firm, measured, unshakable. Call them. Let them run the trace. Let them see the logs. Let them pull the encryption logs and the surveillance backups. And when they do, you better hope they don't check your browser first. I stepped closer. Because, Richard, you're not an investigator, you're a liability, and I planned for those. For the first time, he stepped back. What he didn't realize, what he never even thought to imagine, was that every conversation, every fake friendly comment, every sideways glance I had archived, labeled, stored, not for revenge, for protocol, because if you live long enough in silence, you learn one truth. The loudest noise comes when the fortress you underestimated detonates from the inside. And Richard, he'd just heard the first crack. What he didn't know was the full extent of what I'd built to protect myself, and tonight he would learn its name, Delta Protocol. My secure call with Joint Strategic Operations was still live when I felt the front door click open behind me. I paused, mid-brief eyes flicking to my biometric lockdown system Greene. But then I heard the heavy steps coming down the hall, felt the floor shift under his weight. It was him, Agent Dawson playing hero in his own made-up drama. Before I could shut down the line, he stormed inside the command room. The door slid open without warning, and there he stood, arms crossed, badge glinting face, a storm of righteous indignation. Eliza Carter, Lieutenant General in command of Sensitive Intel Operations. I am placing you under citizen's arrest for impersonation and unauthorized encryption. His voice carried across the room, tearing through the low hum of secure comms and making every ear on the call snap to attention. I kept my eyes locked on the screen, on the colonel waiting for my confirmation. I spoke softly, not for Richard, but for the network. This is an authorized operation. I am the proxy lead on Delta Fireside Conference Protocol. He stepped forward, ignoring my words, ripping the headset off my head. Not tonight. You're coming with me. His hand tossed a pair of cuffs on the desk, polished cold. My heart didn't pound. My mind kicked in. Delta Protocol, I said, voice. Calm, deliberate. Silence over the comms. The colonel paused mid-question. He recognized the code. It meant lockdown. It meant everything beyond that door was classified black, no one in, no one out, and neutralize any unauthorized incursion. Richard should have known that. I slid one cuff around my wrist deliberately, each click ringing in my ears. The colonel's voice cut in faintly. Use, emergency, override, General Carter. I did. The countermeasure kicked in, the doors sealed. Overhead lights dimmed. Cameras shifted to infrared. Comms flickered to encrypted Delta Red. The network confirmed all external links disabled. There were 6 minutes on the Delta clock counting down in my peripheral vision. Richard tried once more. You can't do that. Those are military systems. That's right, I said, voice raising just enough that every word landed. They are military systems, and I'm the authority in the room. Now step back. He hesitated. For a beat, I saw the same uncertainty that flickered months ago in the garage. That's when I pulled the flash drive out of my pocket. Countermeasure R. Anything you need to say now. My tone held no apology, no invitation, just containment. He stumbled. I laid the drive on the table next to the cuffs. The Delta clock is ticking, Richard. You've got 6 minutes to make a choice. The colonel's voice came in again, low and professional. General, confirm detainment and assessment protocol. I have, I said. Agent Dawson here has made several unauthorized entries into classified systems. I recommend he be held under review. Richard looked at the drive, the cuffs, the Delta lock override flashing red on the screen. The fortress had detonated. He had one last chance, and the timer on the wall counted down 0:05:43. He opened his mouth, but this time nothing came out. Just breath. Just the sound of a man realizing he no longer owned the narrative. The room fell into a surreal quiet, the kind you feel before thunder hits. The colonel's voice returned firmer now. "General Carter, confirm safety status. Do you require retrieval?" "Stand by," I replied. My eyes never left Richard, because that was the moment I understood. This wasn't about just stopping him. This was about erasing his illusion that he ever had power over me. He stepped back, barely half a foot. The shuffle of his boot against the tile sounded like retreat. "You really think this is going to work?" he hissed. I almost smiled. "Richard, you broke into a military-grade ops room during a black protocol briefing and physically attempted detainment of a flag officer on duty. Whether or not this works isn't a question. The question is how long your defense attorney will keep you out of federal detention." He swallowed. Then the countdown dropped below 5 minutes. I toggled the emergency retrieval beacon. If I activated it fully, Joint Strategic Command would dispatch a recovery unit. But I waited, gave him the gift of a door still open barely. "I didn't mean to," he started. "But you did." I leaned in. "You meant every knock, every search, every planted doubt in my mother's mind. You just didn't mean to get caught." The walls pulsed red with countdown light. He looked at the flash drive again, and I saw the crack spreading across his certainty. I'd waited years for that sound. Then I stepped toward the console voice level. "Colonel, prepare for black site extraction. I am initiating final phase." Richard backed away, hand trembling. "You're not serious." I didn't reply. Because when you prepare your whole life for war, you don't need to raise your voice to win it. You just have to wait for your enemy to open the door you already locked. And tonight, that door had a name. Me. Then the ground shook. From outside, a low rumble that grew louder, precise, orchestrated, undeniable. I glanced at the Delta clock 00217 remaining. Nanoseconds. Every agent in the room tensed, but I stayed focused on the door. It exploded inward with a thunderous force. 12 black SUVs screeched to a stop at the front entrance, their engines roaring, in tandem with a Black Hawk circling low overhead. The night exploded into tactical insertion. In the split second before the Special Forces team hit the ground, I stepped away from Richard. He stood motionless, eyes wide, not with triumph, but with horror. Behind him, the doors latched shut in bulletproof precision. The hallway lights flashed red. The Delta protocol had triggered extraction. The assault team cleared the room with military precision. Breaching shields comms clipped to helmets. Delta awareness, they broadcast and clipped code. In one swift move, they cuffed Richard and escorted him out. He yelled frantic, spitting accusations. "She's a fraud, a rogue agent." His voice echoed off the steel walls. Outside, the Black Hawk's blade sliced the air. Packs of soldiers rappelled down thick lines, landing 2 feet apart, weapons trained on every corner of the room. The SUV's doors swung, revealing more operatives in full tactical gear. They converged on me, eyes sharp, respectful. One saluted General Carter, Joint Strategic Command orders. Immediate extraction, the perimeters secure. I nodded and retrieved my tablet. The app showed Richard's compromised access logs, the intact chain of custody on countermeasure R, the live comm link still open. The colonel confirmed backup was en route engineers to secure classified terminals and ghillie teams for perimeter sweeps. No one else could enter or exit until they had clearance. A brigadier general stepped in, a figure I had briefed before. He looked at me then, at Richard being led out in cuffs. Recognition flickered in his eyes, then respect. General Carter, your credentials check out. Thanks for initiating Protocol Delta. You did precisely what was required. I exhaled slowly. The noise of Rota's gasping agents and Richard's protest faded behind me. I tapped the tablet initiating data purge protocols across network nodes, self-destruct routines on compromised laptops, and flagged sensitive intel for quarantining. Richard's voice drifted back hoarse. You'll regret this. They'll find my version of events. The Brigadier stepped forward. You have 6 hours before your hearing. Until then, you're secure under UCMJ custody. I watched him let out shoulders sagging, his bluster evaporating. He looked back once, jaw clenched, then vanished into the SUV. The Black Hawk lifted its rotorwash, pushing everyone back a step. The SUVs peeled out. The commandos secured the room. Moments later, I closed the door, reactivated my earpiece and heard the colonel, "You're clear. Extraction team inbound in T-2. I switched the comm off. Alone, I allowed the adrenaline to ebb. I walked to the window. The night sky was still except for the slow, vanishing echo of Black Hawk blades. Somewhere in those choppers were the ones I'd led into crisis sims, the kids I'd trained, the lives I'd saved by turning secrets into strategy. Now, they'd just secured me. Behind me, the Delta clock reset to standby. My tablet chirped mission debrief awaited. No fanfare, no applause, just business. But I felt something else: finality. Richard had been exposed, his narrative shattered. That family myth built on exclusion and doubt lay in pieces behind armoured vehicles. I picked up my comlink and gave an update. Command hostiles secured. Authority confirmed. Countermanding declarations rescinded. Recommend review of domestic OPSEC for immediate guidelines. Delta protocol executed. Silence answered, then an acknowledgement tone. The mission had succeeded without chaos. My gut churned with a mixture of relief and sorrow. This wasn't victory. It was outcome. I lost my father to sudden tragedy. I carved myself from silence and steel. Tonight I confronted another patriarchal shadow and survived. But at what cost? I exhaled and straightened my shoulders. Because this was more than rescue. It was declaration, no one, no fear. No false narrative would define me again. And when I finally stepped out into the rotor's dust, I met my mother in the driveway. She wore a distant, shocked grief for decisions she never saw coming. I offered her an arm. No words, just presence. She squeezed my hand. You did it, she whispered. I did. The Black Hawk receded into darkness. 12 SUVs carried evidence personnel, and a boiled-down truth I outranked every story told about me. In the driveway's dim light, the dust from rotors lingered a hazy curtain between us. We remained still, connected by a moment heavier than words. Behind me, the tactical team loaded bags of C's digital records, countermeasure, R. Richard's notebooks, router logs into waiting vehicles. The Brigadier approached, offering a firm nod. Protocol, Delta executed. We secured everything. Mother and daughter. I nodded, glancing at Mum. She's with me. He gave my shoulder a brief squeeze and turned toward his team. Evelyn stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. In her eyes, I saw a storm of relief, sorrow, guilt, and hope she'd never fully allowed herself until today. We walked toward the house's front door, now empty. I paused in the threshold, fingers lingering on the frame. Eviction of chaos and deception. I turned and met her gaze. We need a debrief, I said, voice low but steady. Internal review, intervention, policy changes. This ends tonight. I won't let it happen again. She exhaled slowly, nodding. Yes. She brushed dust from her sleeve, then looked up with a fierce, quiet strength. My daughter saved me tonight. Inside the house felt hollow, a shell that had once contained decades of family life, now emptied of pretense. We walked into the living room, still immaculate from the raid. I didn't know what came next, but I knew protocol documentation testimonies, chain of custody, formal reprimand assignment of responsibility. I contacted the on-site colonel. Minutes later, we entered the secure makeshift office, set in my former command room, a small space with a long table, secure laptops and evidence binders. On one screen, a video paused at the moment Richard entered during Delta Protocol. On another, logs of his unauthorized access attempts blinked in time-stamped rows. The colonel, 2 uniformed lieutenants, and a civilian legal advisor were assembled. The room hummed with official energy, punctuated by papers shifting and quiet typing. "General Carter, thank you for initiating Protocol Delta," said the colonel, voice formal. He gestured toward a seat. "Mother, thank you for cooperating with us." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice catching. I want to speak." She cleared her throat. "I didn't want Eliza to go through this, but I was afraid of Richard's anger, of causing a scene. Thank you for protecting her." Her eyes glossed. "For protecting us." I placed a hand on her arm. "You protected all of us, Mum, but we need transparency now." The colonel nodded and began. "We have Richard Dawson in evidentiary custody on several charges: unauthorized access to classified systems, attempt to detain a flag officer, misuse of authority and evidence tampering. We recommend internal processing through military justice and local courts." Evelyn exhaled slowly again. "Will he ever face consequences?" The legal advisor cleared their throat. "Yes. Depending on the investigation's outcome, he could face felony charges. At minimum, he will be placed under restrictive supervision and banned from communication with you." She nodded, tears sliding silently. "I want to see him held accountable." I took her hand. "It's not just about accountability, it's protection. For you, for me, for our family's future." Evelyn looked between us. "I'm sorry," her voice cracked, "for everything, for not seeing it, for letting it happen." I squeezed her hand back. "Mum, it's not your fault you didn't see it, but I'm glad you opened your eyes." Now we move forward together. A pause hung heavy with years of unsaid words. Finally, I spoke. "Let's set a home OPSEC protocol. Secure phone, separate login, clear boundaries, legal counsel." The colonel nodded, already taking notes. Mum swallowed. "And for me? For you," I said. Meeting her gaze, we build a safe environment, emotional and digital. And I'll be here. I paused. I've spent my life preparing for threats abroad. Tonight was about a threat at home. Her eyes softened. I don't want to regret my silence again." "You don't have to," I assured her softly. "This is our reset. We signed forms, exchanged commitments. The house, once a stage for doubt, was now ground zero for healing." Outside, the SUVs rolled away. The night sky cleared, leaving just the moonlight and the creak of the front door, closing behind uniformed personnel. After the official meeting, we sat at the kitchen table, the one where I'd once removed a lone carrot from my plate, the place where nasty comments had been tossed into dinner cracks. Tonight, it held 2 laptops, legal binders, cups of untouched coffee. Mum reached across. "May I ask you something?" "Anything. Why didn't you fight back sooner? You had all those protocols, those systems." "Why wait?" I studied her. "Because I needed you. I didn't want you caught in the crossfire." I stayed silent, but I was never powerless. I gave him space to expose himself, and tonight he did. She nodded slowly. "I see now. You were never hiding, you were strategizing." I smiled, the first real one in days. "Exactly. And now that he's exposed our strategy changes, it's time for clarity." She looked at the binders and laptops. "I want to understand. Help me be part of that clarity." I printed our plan: secure Wi-Fi camera, monitored front door, separate office with escort protocols. legal access on any intrusion attempt, printed phone lock instructions, shared how biometrics work, how back-end logs feed to secure server, showed her the flags set on Richard's browser searches. She leaned in, absorbing details. So I'll know if someone tries again. You will, I promised, because from here on you outrank fear. We finished the session. The colonel retrieved surveillance files. The legal advisor finalized affidavits and recommended next steps. My Delta protocol would be refined for domestic scenarios. Home invasion, not by violence, but by quiet coercion, would now be an acknowledged tactic. Exhausted, we closed the binders and cleared the room. As we stepped into the hallway, I felt a weight lift both from me and from Mum. Outside, the house looked different, no longer drab and charged with fear, now quiet with quiet resolve. I turned to Mum. Ready to go home? She smiled a shaky but genuine curve. Yes. We walked out together, the night air cool against our faces. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about a daughter saving her mother. It was about mothers seeing daughters not as shadows or threats, but as equals, as protectors, as generals, as family. I didn't say it out loud, but in the cool of that night, I carried the truth we had rewritten our story. The next morning, the house felt both normal and charged, like the eye of a storm had passed, but the air still crackled. I'd arranged for Richard to meet with military investigators at dawn. When he arrived, he looked smaller, no swagger, no badge propped up on his chest, just a man in custody, 2 officers by his side. I stood in the living room, sunlight filtering through the curtains, dividing the space between us. Mum hovered behind me, hesitant but present. This wasn't about judiciary. It was narrative, my right to reclaim the story I'd lived under his shadow. Richard, I began, voice steady, each word measured. We've been here before, but not like this. He shifted, eyes flicking to the floor, then back. Eliza. No, I raised a hand, stilling him. Not this time. Not with your but. And your memory lapses. You don't get to rewrite this. Not now. I let the silence settle long enough that the ticking clock sounded too loud. Mum's hand pressed into my back, silent support. You weren't asking, I continued. You were demanding I prove myself. Demanding our mother choose you over me. You didn't doubt I was a major general, you feared it. You feared me exceeding you in every arena you once claimed to own. He swallowed. His shoulders sagged. I lost control. I'm sorry. I'm afraid of losing my place. I'm afraid I started to see you not as my stepdaughter, but as a reminder I never mattered. Those words landed like lead. Not because they were false, they weren't, but because they were so late. So you built a case, you picked a fight you couldn't win. You surveilled, you accused, you crossed lines you didn't even know existed anymore because you believed you still owned this house, this family, these stories. He looked up, tears brimming. I didn't mean to destroy you, he whispered. I meant to protect. The family. I shook my head. That's what you told my mother every time I walked into a room. But protection doesn't demand destruction. He blinked. I'm sorry. I let the apology wait because it didn't need forgiveness. It needed acknowledgement. And this was the last moment he'd have it. I stepped forward close enough to see the regret and fear in his eyes. This isn't about punishment, I said quietly. It's about clarity. I'm not here to break you. I'm here to end your license to define me. He trembled. The investigators shifted, waiting to intervene, but I didn't allow it. This was ours. I forgive you if that matters, I said, voice softer but unwavering. But I won't forget. And I won't stay silent. I won't let your story overwrite mine again. He looked at me, a shaky nod, tears slipping free. I thank you. I gave him a taut, sad smile. Don't thank me. Just let this be the end. Mum stepped forward, placing her other hand on mine, forming a quiet wall around me. He broke the trust. But we will rebuild. He closed his eyes and exhaled. He looked older, wiser, maybe broken. Maybe I need help, he whispered. Counselling, antagonism, accountability. I nodded. Yes. And please don't come back to the house unless invited. He held my gaze for a moment, then bowed his head. I turned away, shoulders straight as the investigators moved him toward the door. He paused, looked back once, searching for more. Perhaps forgiveness, perhaps guilt, but I didn't look. I wouldn't offer either. As the door closed and locked behind him, I felt the finality in my chest. The story belonged to me now. The chapter was closed, the narrative reclaimed. I stepped aside and Mum followed. The house was silent, emptier than before, but cleaner. We stood shoulder to shoulder in the hallway. "Are you okay?" she asked. I looked at her, saw the daughter she'd always tried to raise, now a leader who protected her. "Yes, we're okay." She nodded and pressed a gentle kiss to my temple. "I love you, General." I smiled and let the title land where it belonged, not as a symbol of distance, but of who I'd become. "I love you too, Mum." We walked into the quiet of our home together, equal, unburdened. The final words lingered. He hadn't doubted me. He'd been scared, and I'd chosen not to bury him, but to walk away, because I outranked the fear, the story, and even the silence. Now, the house felt like a memory tied together again, not just walls and creaks, but stories waiting to be unfurled. I walked through the entryway, trailing my fingers along the banister that once felt too heavy when I was a kid. Mum followed her steps, careful but determined. We moved into the living room where the air was soft with morning light, as if the house itself was breathing relief. Mum paused, looked at a side cabinet I'd ignored before. "There's something I want to show you," she said. She opened the door and withdrew a framed photo dust motes dancing in the light. It was me 16, in my JROTC uniform, standing tall beside my father's map, the one with the red pins. My hair cropped, short eyes fierce and proud. It was a portrait of promise of who I became before the world told me not to shine. I took the frame, my fingertips brushing over the glass. "You never showed Richard this," I said, voice soft. She shook her head, eyes glistening. "It was your thing, Private. Every time you left for a drill or a competition, you'd come home and lay that photo on the mantel like a beacon. I never had the heart to take it down." She paused. "He tried, multiple times. Said you were clinging to childhood. He thought it would make you less ambitious. I couldn't let him." I leaned against the doorway. I thought maybe he was right. Her smile trembled. "Only because he told you so." She stepped forward, placing her hand over mine on the frame. I was afraid of his answers, his cold look. But I'm not afraid anymore. A warmth uncurled inside me. For the first time in years, the weight of his silence, his skepticism seemed not crushing, but fragile. I set the photo down on the coffee table. This is who I was, and who I even today. She nodded. I always saw it. Even when I didn't say it, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "I want to keep it here," I said, in the living room, a reminder why this house matters. Mum reached for my hand. "Then, let's make space. For it, and for us." We spent the morning rearranging. The photo went on the central shelf. Beneath it, I placed one of Dad's old compasses, the brass tarnished but still functional. She brought out a small wooden box inside my old red pins, kept safe all these years. We sat on the floor, and I touched each one, feeling Dad's presence in its weight, its promise. "Do you remember our map?" I asked, sliding a thumb over the glass. "I do," she whispered. "I remember when he first showed it to you." I leaned into her shoulder. I almost lost it. "All of it." "But you're here," she said, voice strong. "And I'm here too." She walked me back to my old room, the mint walls faded but familiar, Inside, everything was still the ceiling fan, with its uneven click, the patch of floor that creaked with every step. And in the closet, buried under a wool blanket, was the original corkboard. Not the replica I used at the academy. The one. The real one. The one with 2 missing pins in Syria and 1 lone marker where I'd promised him all those years ago. That's where they'll need someone who sees what others don't. I pulled it out, sat cross-legged and just stared. So many holes in the surface, so many stories stitched into geography. She sat beside me, silent. I used to think the world needed more people like Dad, I said slowly. Then I thought it needed someone like me, stronger, colder, strategic. And now she asked. Now, I think it needs people who remember, I said, pressing a red pin into a city I once studied as a cadet. Not just wars, but why we fight them. She reached for my hand. You didn't just survive, Eliza. You carried him forward. There were no speeches, no medals, no toasts, just a corkboard, a daughter, a mother, and the shared weight of finally returning to something that was never gone, only waiting to be uncovered. Later that afternoon, we brewed tea and sat in the kitchen. I noticed she had cleared the old photos off the fridge, the ones with Richard grinning too wide, arm-draped like ownership. In their place, my academy portrait, my promotion notice, and in the corner, a magnet that read, "Strong women raise stronger ones." I smiled. Not for what I had reclaimed, but for what we had rebuilt. I returned to Joint Strategic Operations with renewed purpose. The hallway whispers changed. People who'd once skirted my gaze now paused, offering a nod and General Carter. It wasn't flattery, it was recognition. And it felt different this time. No loneliness, no awkward distance, just acknowledgement. My strength, hard-earned, no longer invisible. My calendar filled with visits, presentations, strategic reviews. But what I looked forward to most was a panel I'd agreed to lead at the Women in Defence Summit, a chance to speak not as a silent operator behind screens, but as a beacon. When I walked onto that stage, standing under the spotlight with my mother watching from the audience, I heard something I never had before applause that meant more than admiration. It meant connection. They called me General Carter. One of the organisers whispered, "It's inspiring to see you here, shoulder to shoulder with other young women." It warmed me, because this was always why I fought. So they'd never feel like I did. Back in my office, inside the drawer, I kept the modest photo of Mum's roast night hug. Her hand on my shoulder, I gazed at it before closing it away. It was simple, her at the anniversary celebration, eyes kind and full of pride, pressing gently, as if physically grounding me in her love. That quiet image spoke louder than any medal. I arranged for that photo to be framed and placed on my desk. Now, every time I signed briefs or prepared intel files, I could see her faith, her sacrifice, her strength. I thought of the girls watching me from afar. Girls who were told to shrink, to be quiet, to let ambition be someone else's fight. I pictured them finding courage in my story, finding their own. Late one evening, I found myself alone in the command centre. The soft hum of monitors, the steady pulse of encrypted comms. It was home. I stood before the map wall, tracing lines of current deployments, threat strategic points. My finger rested on a city marked for a women's leadership conference, where tomorrow I'd open with a keynote. I pressed my palm to the glass over the pin. I felt my father's presence one last time, and inside, the silence I carried for so long turned into resolve. He tried to define me with handcuffs, I whispered, not to anyone in particular, but to the echo of my past. But I outranked every story he ever told about me. In that moment, there was no fear, no doubt, just clarity. I closed my eyes and saw a line of red pins stretching across the world, every calculated place where someone needed someone who sees what others don't. The command center lights dimmed as systems restarted for the night. I powered off the monitors and left my office. Behind me, on the desk, Mum's picture caught the moonlight, 2 women unbroken. Ahead of me, the path glowed with purpose. Ahead, a future full of girls with grit ready to stand. And I would be there for them, not as a silent shadow, but as proof, a daughter, a soldier, a general, visible, formidable, unstoppable. Some stories end in courtrooms or ceremonies. Mine ends here with a chair that used to mean absence and now means authority. There's a chair in my office no one ever sits in. It's tucked beside the bookshelf, just far enough from the desk to not be part of the conversation, but never out of sight. A replica almost of the one I stood next to during my mother's 25th anniversary. Same plain wood, same slight lean to the left. I had it delivered from a local carpenter, custom finished in the colour of silence. Some people ask about it. I tell them it's decorative, but really, it's a placeholder. For all the girls who were told they were too much or too quiet or too ambitious, for all the daughters who were left out of the slideshow, left out of the toast, left out of the story. That chair is their witness stand, their command post, their proof. Sometimes when the day's debriefs are done, I sit in it myself, not out of nostalgia, but out of grounding. To remember the version of me who stood quietly in rooms that forgot her, who survived dinner tables as battlefields, who learned to turn absence into strategy. These days, I sign documents as General Carter. I run simulations that keep regions from collapse. I brief leaders on risks they haven't even named yet. But it's that chair that reminds me who I do it for. There's a photo on my desk now, framed in simple silver. It's from the recognition ceremony 3 months after the incident. My mother, standing just behind me, her hand resting on my shoulder. Her face not proud, not tearful, just steady. Like she finally saw me not as her defense or her mistake, but as her equal. Her blood reborn in steel. They called me to the podium that day. A room full of decorated officials, analysts, tech chiefs, and field agents. They called me the spine of Delta. I walked up calm, composed, my mother's hand still warm on my back. And when I turned to face them, I didn't give a speech. I gave a sentence. Just one. He tried to define me with handcuffs, but I outranked every story he ever told about me. No one clapped right away. They just stood, silent, until someone whispered, "For the girls with grit." Then the applause began, not for me, but for all the chairs once left empty. I leave the photo in plain sight, so that when the next young officer steps into my office, nervous, unpolished, still trying to shrink into her own brilliance, she sees it. She sees not a lecture, but a lineage. Because some stories don't end when the war does. They end when the silence is broken, when the truth is no longer something you survive, but something you command. I don't know if there will ever be another dinner where my mother and I don't pause when the air shifts, or another room where I don't check for exits. But I do know this: the story I tell now is mine. It's stitched in steel and silence, and the sound of a helicopter rotor slicing through doubt. I don't walk behind my past. I walk beside it with rank, with truth, with command. And for the first time in my life, when I enter a room, I don't wonder if I'm welcome. I decide. When the truth is no longer something you survive, but something you command. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or underestimated, this story was for you. And if it echoed something in your own silence, don't let it end here. Drop your stories in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to know they're not alone. And if you'd like to hear more voices like this, real, raw, resilient, hit subscribe. You have a seat at this table, always.